Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you all for joining today's webinar titled Why My Mother's Prenatal Diet and Pre-Pregnancy Weight Matter, Impact of Offspring Growth in Neurodevelopment. My name is Maha Sheikh, and I am the Communication Specialist for the Jordan Nutrition Innovation Lab. As more attendees are joining this webinar, I'll begin by going over some of the logistical items. Next, please. I would like to direct all attendees to a few functions on this Zoom call. At the bottom of your screen, you should see a chat icon and a Q&A icon. Please use the chat feature to introduce yourself and engage in relevant conversation with the other attendees. Next, please. If you have a question for our speaker, please use the Q&A feature. We have allotted the final 15 minutes of this webinar for Q&A, at which point our speaker will respond to any questions from the audience. This webinar is being recorded and it will be made available on our website following the event. We will repeat these technical housekeeping items in the chat throughout the webinar as people may be joining in at later times. Next, please. I would now like to introduce Haneen Abouleila, the Country Coordinator for the Jordan Nutrition Innovation Lab, who will talk more about the lab and introduce our moderator for today's webinar. Haneen, over to you.
Thank you very much, Maha. Welcome, everyone. I want to introduce myself first. My name is Haneen Abouleila, and I am the Country Coordinator for the Jordan Nutrition Innovation Lab. I am really thrilled to open our third webinar for this year and happy to see people joining and many familiar names. So before I introduce our moderator for today, I would like to give a brief introduction to the Jordan Nutrition Innovation Lab. So the Jordan Nutrition Innovation Lab is a research and capacity building program that is funded by USAID Jordan and under Feed the Future initiative. We pursue research and capacity building activities to support the health and the nutrition of women of reproductive age, pregnant lactating women, and infants and young children in Jordan. Some of our key objectives are implementing a rigorous maternal and child nutrition research agenda, including conducting an analysis of existing nationally representative data sets and conducting comprehensive evaluations of programs such as USAID's Community Health and Nutrition Program. Moreover, we build individual and institutional capacity through the award of fellowships, scientific symposia, workshops, and webinars. As part of the capacity building agenda, recently JNL awarded 4 competitively selected fellows. And over the next 9 months, with the support from JNL, the fellows will conduct their studies and complete publication-ready research in the field of the maternal and infant young children nutrition. In addition, we conduct these webinars on a regular basis as a means to conduct outreach to a wider stakeholder group in and outside Jordan. This webinar is moderated by Dr. Shibani Ghosh. I now would like to introduce you to Dr. Ghosh. She is a research associate professor at the Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy. She is the associate director for the Feed the Future Food Systems and the Nutrition Innovation Lab, and also the principal investigator of the Jordan Nutrition Innovation Lab. She has experience working in the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, and South Asia, and her research interests are in understanding the role of agriculture in improving nutrition while ensuring health, assessing the diet and non-diet determinants of nutritional status of infant and young children, and testing interventions aimed at improving maternal and infant nutrition and growth. Dr. Shibani, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Haneen, for the very gracious introduction. Welcome, everybody, to the third Jordan Nutrition Innovation Lab webinar of this year. We're very excited to have Dr. Carmen Montedrez from the Brigham and Women's Hospital as our key speaker today. And her topic is really building off the webinars that we've had, the first two webinars we've had this year. And if you have not had the opportunity, please, I urge you to visit our website and listen to the other two webinars on this topic. Let me introduce you to Dr. Montedrez. She is an attending neonatologist in the newborn intensive care unit at the Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, Massachusetts. And she is also an instructor in pediatrics at the Harvard Medical School. She co-leads the Harvard Nutrition and Obesity Research Center, Associate Member Council. In addition, for caring for sick neonates in the NICU, Dr. Montedrez also does research on the effects of maternal, pre, and early pregnancy obesity on infant outcomes. She's pursuing clinical and translational research pertaining to the impact of pre-pregnancy obesity and prenatal diet quality on child obesity, brain and neurodevelopment, with a focus on inflammatory mechanisms, which may underpin these associations. Dr. Montedrez received her MD at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine and completed her residency in pediatrics and a fellowship in neonatal perinatal medicine at Boston Children's Hospital Harvard Combined Programs. Dr. Carmen, please welcome, and the floor is now yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gosh, for this wonderful introduction, and thank you for inviting me to present my research on this platform. So I'm going to share my screen, and please let me know if you're able to see them.
Yes, we can see them, Carmen.
Okay, perfect. Okay. So, so today, as Shivani said, I'm going to really talk about the impact of prenatal diet and pre-pregnancy weight, or BMI, and their influence on child growth in terms of obesity outcome and adiposity outcome, as well as neurodevelopment. So I have no conflicts to disclose. So for today's objective, we've reviewed current trends in pre-pregnancy obesity and dietary patterns. I'm going to highlight some of the similarities between trends both in the States and in Jordan. We'll discuss the role of maternal obesity and prenatal diet on child health outcomes. We'll also describe how maternal weight and in pregnancy and the related in-utero environment shapes developmental adaptations in pregnancy, which then lead to these adverse offspring outcomes. So to try to really elucidate some of the mechanistic pathways that have been uncovered from animal models and some of the translational studies that we've done in the lab. We'll also review some of the potential role of nutritional intervention in pregnancy, and I will discuss some of the current challenges and on current studies, as well as sort of next step for future direction in order to address some of the current gaps in the literature. So this is really to set the stage when it comes to the overall prevalence of obesity worldwide, and particularly highlighting North America, as well as the North Africa, Middle East area. And as you can see here, when you're looking at overall prevalence, we're estimating about a 30 to 40% prevalence of obesity worldwide, typically, really particularly in North America, in the US. And if you look at countries in North Africa, as well as the Middle East, you can also see the region here that is highlighted, representing Jordan. And you can see that really the similarities are obvious when it comes to the prevalence of obesity worldwide between these two countries. Particularly among women with in Jordan, when it comes to obesity, the prevalence is also very similar to the US, where about 1 in 3 women have obesity. When it really comes to sort of changes in obesity prevalence over time, you can see here on the in figure B that there's really increasing levels of obesity or higher BMI with increasing age. And our figure in figure C, this is a figure that really breaks down the prevalence of obesity and overweight and normal weight by age group. And you can see here that, among women that are less than 30, the majority of women in this age group in Jordan actually have normal weight, as represented by the green bar. But when you're comparing you're sort of assessing and looking at the prevalence of obesity in the older age group, as represented by the red bar, you can see here that there's really an increasing prevalence of obesity as women get older. So particularly in the bracket that is sort of considered women of childhood reproductive age, in the 30 to 39 range, you can see here that it's nearing 30%. When it comes to diet, and the reason why it's important to look at diet is because obviously dietary quality influences obesity risks and weight gain. And I've highlighted here the sort of average HEI score, which is an index of dietary quality, or the alternate healthy eating index, which really represents scores obtained from major food groups. And this paper that was published in last year really did a great job at really summarizing the average dietary quality in the population according to age group on the x-axis, and according to regions worldwide. And I've highlighted in the red bracket the regions represented by the Middle East and North Africa. And in general, you can really see sort of a J type distribution or relationship when it comes to the overall dietary index. So in the early childhood period, you can see here that there's really across the different regions worldwide, there's a higher dietary quality as represented by high HEI score. But as people get older, you can see that particularly in the older, in later childhood, as well as early adolescence, the quality of the diet really significantly decreases. And in the area that I've highlighted in the oval, with the oval shape that represents sort of people of reproductive age, you can see here that the dietary scores are also lower compared to people that are much older, so in general, people that are over 50, which really highlighted the importance of looking at the impact of dietary quality among women of childbearing age here, and the potential impact that it has on pregnancy outcome as well as childhood outcomes. And I've also included the trends when it comes to the Mediterranean diet score, which we know is really high in unsaturated fatty acids and legumes and vegetables. The trends here are also really quite similar, where you really see that particularly in this sort of middle age or childbearing age period, that the dietary quality is not as robust as it is in a later childhood period. But these discrepancies really much more seen when you are evaluating the effects of the changes in dietary quality as it pertains to the HEI index, and less so when it pertains to the Mediterranean diet scores. So these figures really just serve to highlight the overall global prevalence of obesity, with an estimated 1 in 3 women of reproductive age having obesity, both in the US and Jordan. We also see that dietary quality among women of productive age is poor compared to earlier in the life course. And so why is this important, and what are the implications on the next generation? So the next part of the talk is going to really focus on the impact of maternal obesity and prenatal diet on neurodevelopmental outcomes. And this figure is not meant to be read in detail, but it's just sort of highlights sort of major papers that have been published over the last decade or so on the overall impact of maternal obesity on childhood neurodevelopmental outcomes. And multiple studies, large epidemiological studies worldwide have evaluated this association, and there's really consistent associations between higher pre-pregnancy BMI and higher risk for ADHD in the child, higher risk for autism in the child, higher risk for anxiety and depression, higher risk for schizophrenia. And even in terms of eating behaviors, there's also a strong association between increased risk for food addiction and other eating disorders. And we'll briefly touch upon some of the mechanistic pathways that have been postulated based on animal model as to why this is the case. And then finally, just overall risk for increased neurocognitive impairments in these children. We undertook a observational cohort analysis, really looking at the associations between maternal pre-pregnancy, BMI, obesity, and specific markers of early childhood neurodevelopmental outcomes. This was an analysis using the Project Viva cohort, which is a longitudinal pre-birth cohort that recruited women in early pregnancy in Massachusetts, and followed both the mothers and the child longitudinally. And the study is now in its 18th and 19th year, where children are also now being followed for long-term adult cardiovascular outcomes. And here we really wanted to highlight the associations between pre-pregnancy obesity, so categorized as having a BMI over 30, and lower scores on visual motor ability in early childhood, particularly in a fine motor subset, which obviously is important when it comes to learning skills. But visual motor abilities is actually a precursor for early executive function skills, which is also important in academia and just lifelong, just life productivity. We wanted to take a look at what has been postulated as the main mechanistic pathways in this association, and try to translate some of the animal data into sort of clinical studies. And so I borrowed this very comprehensive diagram from a paper that was published by Andrea Edlow in 2017. And it really nicely highlights the mechanistic pathways that have been implicated in a developmental programming and adverse neurodevelopment in these children. And essentially, maternal obesity and a poor dietary quality really leads to alterations in the in-utero milieu that is really characterized by a high degree of inflammation, both in the maternal circulation, but as well as in the placenta. And so in the placenta, what is seen is a high degree of lipotoxicity and high degree of oxidative stress, and a high degree of cytokines. And these perturbations in the in-utero milieu leads to alterations in placental function, which then impacts fetal development, particularly when it comes to brain development. There's really changes to leptin and insulin signaling in the brain, which are important for homeostasis control and weight regulation, as well as eating behaviors. There are alterations in the 5-HT or serotonin pathways, which are important for mood regulation. There are alterations in the DA or dopaminergic signaling pathways, which are important for reward and emotional regulation. As you can see how that might together influence risks for these neurodevelopmental effects I mentioned earlier in terms of alterations in appetite and eating behaviors, as well as mood and disorders, and as well as cognitive impairments. And you really see this and I didn't include this for to just be succinct, but when you really look at the animal data that has been published on the matter, there you can see on immunohistochemistry of the brain of the pups that have been isolated and born to dams with obesity. You can see alterations in these pathways and a high degree of inflammation in the brain, and a high degree of alterations in the dopaminergic signaling. And in terms of phenotype, these pups, once they are weaned from their mothers, tend to have alterations in behavior that are consistent with the phenotype that is observed in humans in terms of autistic-like behavior and anxiety and sort of a depressed sort of phenotype. And so what really is happening at the level of the microstructure of the brain? So alterations in inflammatory signaling that is related to poor dietary intake, or just inflammation related to a high degree of adiposity in the mother with obesity, really alters or changes the microstructure of the brain. There's decreased proliferation of neurons due to decreased neurotrophic factors. There is impairment in synaptic remodeling. There's reduced migration and maturation of those neuronal cells, and impaired cell-to-cell signaling. And so what evidence then exists in humans that obesity-related inflammation and poor dietary quality are linked to impaired neurodevelopment in offspring? We undertook this study, again, using the longitudinal cohort study, the VIVA study, to look at the role of inflammation in pregnancy and effects on neurodevelopment. And first, we wanted to establish the link between maternal obesity and inflammation. And here you can see we measured CRP in pregnancy. We also measure plasma omega-6 and omega-3s, and took the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 to represent sort of an adverse fatty acid profile, as omega-6 are generally thought to be pro-inflammatory and omega-3s are generally thought to be anti-inflammatory. We also assessed a dietary, an index of dietary quality called a dietary inflammatory index, which essentially is a representation of how inflammatory one's diet is, by looking at sort of overall correlations between the intake of certain nutrients and their strong association with inflammatory markers. And so what we saw here was that maternal obesity was linked to higher CRP in the second trimester, higher plasma omega-6 to omega-3, as well as higher dietary inflammatory index, just highlighting the degree of inflammation, both systemic and from a dietary source that is associated with obesity. Then we looked at how these various markers of inflammation were associated with neurodevelopmental outcomes in children. And again, we saw that inflammation, as measured by CRP, was linked to lower fine motor skills in children. A high omega-6 to omega-3 ratio was linked to lower verbal scores in children, as well as lower visual motor scores. And then finally, a higher dietary inflammatory index in pregnancy was linked to lower verbal scores in terms of neurodevelopmental outcomes in these children. We then performed mediation analysis, really looking at the extent to which inflammation mediated the associations between maternal obesity and offspring visual motor outcomes. And we showed that maternal CRP measured in the second trimester explained up to 28% of the relationship between obesity and offspring visual motor outcomes, really highlighting the mediating role of inflammation in the associations between obesity, pre-pregnancy obesity, and neurodevelopmental outcomes. We also looked at the role of inflammation and whether it differs across semesters. And so because there is sort of this evidence or early evidence suggesting that the timing of inflammation may also matter when it comes to adverse developmental programming and effects on brain development in these high-risk cohorts. And so using data from a randomized control study where we randomized mothers with obesity in to obtain BMI-based prenatal vitamins, supplements really made of, in general, macronutrients rich in vitamin C, E, and folate, essentially looked at whether inflammation as measured by CRP in this study was associated with the odds of failing any domains of the ages and stages questionnaire, which was reported failed by families, by parents. And so what we saw was that first trimester, so essentially CRP measured early in pregnancy around 10 weeks of gestational age, was modestly associated with increased odds of failing in the problem-solving domain on the ASQ. But when we looked at the impact or the role of inflammation measured in the second or third trimester, we really didn't see any significant associations between CRP and neurodevelopmental outcomes as measured by the ASQ. Essentially, it's suggesting that inflammation early in pregnancy may play a role in the developmental programming of these adverse outcomes, and potentially might inform future studies looking at modulating inflammation as a protective mechanism for these children, specifically when it comes to the timing of the intervention. As some of you may know, there have been multiple studies looking at the role of fish oil supplementation in pregnancy, not necessarily in mothers with obesity specifically, but just in general, and there really hasn't been any significant results have been really mixed when it comes to overall impact or overall effects of fish oil supplementation to target improvements in neurodevelopmental outcomes. But the majority of these studies were really started in the second trimester of pregnancy. So additional studies are really needed to assess whether the timing of the intervention matters. We additionally looked at the impact or the association between maternal obesity and brain development. And so these were mothers that were also recruited in pregnancy from a cohort in WashU, and their mothers were followed through pregnancy, and the children had MRI. These were all term well newborns that had MRI in the first couple of weeks of life. And the primary goal of this cohort study was actually to look at the impact of adverse social condition in pregnancy and how that impacts brain development and neurodevelopmental outcomes, but I leveraged the data from this study to be able to look specifically at the impact of maternal obesity. And so here what we saw was that fetuses or newborns that were exposed to obesity in utero had overall lower regional brain volume, specifically in areas that are found to be important in executive dysfunction and emotional dysregulation, namely in terms of emotional regulation and executive control. And so we saw sort of differences in the thalamus with lower brain volume in this region. We saw lower brain volume in the pars orbicularis, which is in the frontal cortex, which is important in executive function. And we also saw differences of lower volume in the superior temporal lobe, which is important when it comes to learning. And so when we were also interested in sort of the effects by sex, because there was plenty of evidence from animal studies showing that there's a sexual dimorphism when it comes to the associations between maternal obesity and offspring brain development. And what we found was actually very interesting. We saw that in girls, particularly, exposure to maternal obesity in utero was linked specifically to lower caudate and thalamic volumes. And these are regions, again, that are important in emotional and behavioral regulations. And then in boys, specifically, exposure to obesity in utero was linked to only to lower volume in the superior temporal lobes, which I mentioned before is important. It's a region that's important in learning and the processing of facial expression and language, which ties in really nicely for the boys in terms of risk for autism, and then for the girls in terms of risk for anxiety and sort of mood disorders. And it really translates and is very consistent with what has been shown in the animal literature in terms of sort of the dimorphism when it comes to the impact of obesity pre-pregnancy on brain development and offspring outcomes. So I took it a step further and wanted to look at the potential protective role of dietary quality in pregnancy, particularly in these dyads. So, showed before that in general, both obesity and dietary quality may be linked to adverse offspring neurodevelopmental outcomes and brain development. And showed in a prior slide that obesity is linked to lower regional volumes in these important brain regions that are associated with cognition and behavior. And so this cohort just happened to also have, not just so happened, but also had dietary data available. And so what we did is we looked specifically in the cohort of infants exposed to obesity in utero and asked ourselves whether having a higher dietary quality, or better dietary quality, was associated with improved regional volumes in these areas of concerns. And so we essentially assess dietary quality as having a higher ratio of unsaturated fatty acids to saturated fatty acids. As I mentioned before, unsaturated fatty acids in general, namely the three type fatty acids, are anti-inflammatory, and saturated fatty acids are very, very pro-inflammatory. And so given the role of inflammation when it comes to this developmental programming, we wanted to see if an improvement in a diet that is particularly anti-inflammatory would be protective in these newborns. And so what we saw when you looked at figure A and figure B is that among these newborns that are exposed to obesity in utero, if a mother had better dietary quality as reported by having a higher tercile of omega-3 and 6 intake in relationship to saturated fats, these newborns had higher regional brain volume, both in the caudate and the thalamus, as well as in general the subcortical gray matter, as represented in figure B, essentially suggesting that that among these vulnerable dyads, that a better dietary quality in pregnancy may be protective. So this study is a really good preliminary study that may inform a future intervention in pregnancy, really particularly focusing on the role of diet and how that may be protective for these infants when it comes to long-term risks. So in terms of current challenges, and I've already alluded to these before, so observational studies really have shown a link between prenatal omega-6 to 3 ratio and fish intake and neurodevelopmental outcomes in children. However, several meta-analyses of published RCTs looking at the effect of long-chain supplementation on child developmental outcomes revealed really mixed results, and really didn't demonstrate any sort of strong significant effects. And so there have been multiple challenging sort of methodological limitations in these studies. And in general, interventions were started later in pregnancy, which may be missing what may be the most critical periods of brain development and a high susceptibility to in-utero metabolic disturbances. But also the populations that were evaluated in these studies weren't very high-risk populations. So in general, there were low prevalence of lower socioeconomic status mothers with lower socioeconomic status, or lower prevalence of mothers with diabetes or obesity in pregnancy, and also just in general lack of racial and ethnic diversity. So essentially imploring and begging for additional studies, really looking at these important factors and having a really diverse cohort of mother-infant diets with sort of an established higher risks at baseline to evaluate the impact of this intervention in pregnancy. And an additional sort of challenge, and hopefully studies that will address this in the future, is whether we have figured the sort of the proper dosing for any studies looking at supplementation in pregnancy, and particularly in mothers with obesity. And so I took I sort of evaluated the potential effects of supplementation in pregnancy when it comes to omega-3 fish oil, and how levels achieved vary according to BMI status. And so across all three groups of mothers, both lean mothers, mothers with overweight BMI, and mothers with obese BMI, we saw a significant increase as seen by the positive value on the y-axis here in terms of the change in DHA and EPA. So all mothers had a significant increase in the DHA and EPA. But what we saw was that there was an attenuated sort of effect in the obese group compared to the lean group, whereby there was a 50% reduction in the change in DHA and EPA that was observed in mothers with obesity compared to mothers with lean. So it sort of begs the question of whether the same dose should be used for mothers with obesity compared to mothers with normal weight, and really evaluating and looking at additional studies that may look at the role of various dosing and to establish really the proper dosing for mothers with obesity, because it's possible that that we still haven't really figured out the appropriate dosing for these mothers. So not only the appropriate dosing, but as I mentioned before, the actual sort of critical timing for intervention. So this is really just a slide to just say that, you know, lack of evidence of an effect is not the same thing as having evidence that there is no effect. You know, there are challenging issues with prior studies looking at omega-3 supplementation or fish oil supplementation or dietary intervention in pregnancy and randomized controlled trial. And I think it's really important to look at populations that have the highest risks at baseline as population of target, and looking at sort of the timing of intervention as really critical in evaluating the impact of such intervention, but also choosing the right assessment tools. In general, studies tend to look at Baileys, which are, you know, easy enough and sort of standardized across the board, but the Bailey may not necessarily be sensitive enough to detect really specific cognitive processes that may be differentially impacted by like specific biological pathways. So what I mean by that is that, for example, in prior slide, I've shown that there are specific differences in specific areas of the brain that are important for emotional regulation, for executive function. And so if we are just assessing cognitive function in general by just, you know, looking at overall motor scores, or overall language scores or cognitive scores, we might not necessarily really be able to look at sort of specific differences in these more specific domains of cognition. So it's really important to look at areas of the brains that are modulated by intervention and how these areas relate to specific function and assess these functions specifically. So, you know, attention, emotional regulation, processing speed, problem solving, higher order cognitive functions are all regulated by specific areas of the brain. And so this is really food for thought for future studies looking at possible intervention. So in summary, pre-pregnancy maternal BMI and prenatal diet are associated with adverse offspring brain and neurodevelopmental outcomes. Obesity and diet-related inflammation are important mediators in this relationship. And so there might be a role for intervention in mothers with obesity in pregnancy, particularly early in pregnancy, when it comes to protecting the offspring from adverse neurodevelopmental effects. But additional studies are needed that would need to address some of the challenges that I mentioned earlier. And so for the next part of the talk, I'll review some of our findings on the associations between maternal obesity and diet and child growth outcomes. So the first half was focusing on neurodevelopmental outcomes and inflammation and mechanistic pathways. And this next half is going to focus on growth and obesity outcomes. So it's not a surprise, just like as we're seeing an increasing rate of maternal obesity worldwide in the States, in Jordan, we are also seeing an increasing prevalence of childhood obesity. So particularly among children in sort of later childhood, it seems, at least in the early childhood period, given sort of the various public health interventions that have been made, that there might be a sort of a stable or plateauing of the offspring outcomes between the age of 2 and 5, but we're still seeing an increase, overall increased rates of obesity in children. But the caveat here is that this data really stops at 2018, and there's really now emerging data, particularly during the COVID pandemic, showing a significant jump in prevalence, even among children in early childhood between the age of 2 and 5. And so we're waiting for the CDC to sort of update this graph to really show where we are now in 2023. I found this really nice figure representing the prevalence of obesity for children in Jordan. As you can see here, just looking at the figure, what stands out to most of us are the bars with the speckled dots, right? So that represents the prevalence of children with obesity. On the x-axis are the different age group. As you can see here, really, like the highest prevalence is really in middle childhood, with the prevalence in early childhood and later childhood being similar. But it really seems like the peak is really in the middle childhood period, which really parallel the findings that we're seeing in America. And so why does this matter? So this figure really shows the projected prevalence of obesity at future age among 2-year-old based on pooled nationally representative data of different cohorts in the States. And this represents about 40 or 42,000 children. And so in figure 4A, essentially what this is showing is that among obese children, the authors really found that the probability that they will still be obese at the age of 35 increased with age from about 75% among current 2-year-old children with obesity to nearly 90% among 15-year-old with obesity. In figure 4B, you really see that these probabilities for later obesity increases with increasing childhood obesity severity. So for example, the probability of obesity in adulthood is nearly 85% for 5-year-old with severe obesity compared to 65% for overweight 5-year-olds. Really, in general, this figure just highlights the fact that we should really be concerned about our current trends in childhood obesity, in the sense that the majority of these children that are currently obese in early childhood will be obese, will have obesity as adults. And so why does this matter? We know that childhood obesity is linked to chronic health problems through the lifespan. And as I mentioned before, increased risk for obesity long-term as adult. And so there's in childhood, there's increased risk for hypertension and dyslipidemia, increased risk for insulin resistance, Obviously issues with self-esteem and that we see highly prevalent in children with obesity, but as adults, just these children will develop type 2 diabetes, they develop cardiovascular diseases, they'll have increased risks for some type of cancer, there'll be associated psychosocial problems, sleep apneas, a slew of problems, right? And so this is very concerning. And outside of sort of the medical implications long term, there's obviously a significant financial impact when it comes to caring for children with obesity as well as adults with obesity. And so obviously there are multiple risk factors for childhood obesity. Childhood obesity is really a multifactorial disease. We cannot talk about obesity without talking about home and family characteristics, about community and neighborhood characteristics, such as the availability of affordable foods in the community that are healthy, as well as play space and green space for activity for children. But one thing that I wanted to focus here in our diagram on the left is really the important role of perinatal factors. And so that really is going to bring me back to maternal obesity and maternal diet. And so this slide is a very complicated slide, but it really just summarizes the mechanistic pathways that mediate the association between maternal nutritional status and offspring obesity and metabolic syndrome. And so the data, the figure here really represents the data that is derived primarily from rodent animal and non-human primate models, suggesting that a suboptimal maternal diet in pregnancy and excess maternal weight really leads to altered maternal physiology, so insulin resistance, excess lipids and fats, inflammation that affects the placenta and affects the programming of developmental pathways in utero. And so we're talking here about brain pathways, lipid metabolism in adipose tissues, adipocyte hypertrophy, alterations in the liver, in the pancreas, in the heart, and all of these alterations in utero really sets the stage for adverse outcomes in these children. And so some of the sort of more novel translational studies that have been done in human cohort looking at cord blood have really found that epigenetics may play a role. So both in animal studies, but also in cord blood studies from human, essentially showing that this in utero environment is associated with epigenetic modification that then lead to alterations in genes that are involved in the various pathways that we just mentioned, that puts the children at risk for having adverse outcome long term. And so we wanted to take a look at the role of dietary quality and how it may be associated with long-term BMI trajectory. Again, I looked at data from the Project Viva cohort, this pre-birth cohort that I mentioned previously. We evaluated the role of 3 different types of dietary quality in pregnancy. So the dietary inflammatory index, which I mentioned before, which is a representation of how inflammatory one's diet is. The role of the alternate healthy eating index in pregnancy, which I also mentioned before, when it came to dietary quality as assessed in populations, and even the Mediterranean diet score. And so what I wanted to highlight here is that we looked at sort of growth changes over time. And what we found what was interesting is that prenatal dietary quality really seemed to be associated with BMI, increasing BMI Z-scores, particularly in the middle childhood period, which is really interesting because remember when we were looking at the impact of maternal diet, the maternal obesity, on a prior graph, we really saw that that there was a particular difference in the mid-childhood period. And even when we looked at still sort of the overall trends in obesity in childhood, we did see that that children of in the middle childhood age group tend to be more affected or tend to have an increasing rate of obesity. So we saw that there were an effect based on a dietary inflammatory index scores, but also based on the Mediterranean diet score in pregnancy, but we did not see any differences based on the alternate healthy eating index for pregnancy. And then we think that it might be related to the different types of nutrients that were assessed in these various dietary quality indices, the dietary inflammatory index and the Mediterranean diet score, really looking particularly at the role of unsaturated fats and saturated fats. This was a study that was conducted by Chloe Andrew, one of our project manager and current doctoral student in the Tufts program, really looking at the role of maternal obesity on neonatal adiposity, and really finding that mothers with high BMI class, obese category, tended to have children that had higher fat mass and higher body fat percentage. And she found out through mediation analysis that maternal glucose metabolism really played an important role when it came to the association between maternal obesity and fat mass in the neonatal period. And why do we care about fat mass in the neonatal period? We care about this because there's actually an increased risk for overweight and obesity among children that have higher neonatal adiposity. So it really starts as early as the neonatal period, and really trying to understand sort of the implication of maternal diet and maternal pregnancy, maternal BMI on offspring growth longitudinally really should start by evaluating fat mass in a neonatal period. Having a large baby, contrary to popular belief, both in Africa and I assume in the Middle East, it's not necessarily a good thing. And so focusing on this aspect of early life programming it will be very important. This is another slide that essentially shows the association between obesity and little child BMI. So we've shown here the link with neonatal adiposity, and here the link is with little childhood obesity. And I'm highlighting really sort of greater risk for childhood overweight and obesity among mothers with the highest BMI category, with the red box in both slides, really showing that the impact is significantly higher with the high BMI group, but that the impact is also significantly higher among older children, as represented by the light blue and the green, the light blue and the red bars. We wanted to, yes.
This is, sorry, I'm just keeping track of time. We have about 8 minutes, and we have quite a few Q&A lined up for you.
Of course. I will stop here and just summarize the last, because the last part was really related to the role of depression in pregnancy and how that interacts with how that may worsen adiposity outcome, but I can review that if a question comes up with regards to the role of depression. So in summary, pre-pregnancy BMI and prenatal dietary quality are linked to adverse offspring growth outcome from birth to adolescence. Childhood obesity is linked to later adult obesity and metabolic syndrome. Prenatal metabolic dysregulations, such as inflammation and glycemia control, as well as epigenetics, may play important mechanistic roles in these associations. We didn't review this, but we also found that prenatal psychosocial stress, when it's measured with depression or anxiety scores, may actually worsen these associations. So trials evaluating the effects of pregnancy dietary intervention on offspring adiposity may require long-term follow-up, at least through early adolescence. A lot of intervention studies have stopped in a neonatal period, and some, if not most, have not found significant association in an early childhood period. But as I've shown, some of these effects really are not apparent until later in life. But we do need additional studies to really evaluate the impact of nutritional intervention in pregnancy, particularly in the conception period, on child growth outcomes. So these are to acknowledge the various members in our laboratory group, as well as my collaborators, particularly Perry, who presented previously in this forum on our work here that I presented today. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Carmen, so much. This is so fabulous. Lots to unpackage, and I'm sorry we didn't have enough time to go through your data on psychosocial stress, because I think that's also a really huge sort of factor that is likely to affect a woman's diet during pregnancy or pre-pregnancy, and that might have further impacts. Lots of good questions coming up. So maybe if I can just, go into the first one. When we're looking at dietary quality, and I don't know if you've had, and I'm sure in the analysis you've looked at it from the perspective of socioeconomic status. I think one of the questions was whether if any of the poor diet quality estimates that you see or have reviewed in the papers are driven by income. So that's really the first question that popped up.
Very good question. So we did adjust for differences in maternal SES status, education, income, with our analysis. So obviously, there's always possibility for residual confounding when you look at observational studies, but these associations have been pretty consistent across multiple cohorts, including higher income countries. And so I really do believe that, yes, of course, there's an association and there's a strong link between the ability to afford, fish and legumes and fresh vegetables and with income. But even after adjusting for these differences at baseline, we do see that just diet in itself has a strong association. Obviously, if you add being, in the lower SES strata, I am sure that the association will be much stronger because of sort of lack of availability.
Right. So it is very likely that they're more disproportionately affected. It's just that the relationship of diet stands by itself with the outcomes. So that's really, really helpful. So another question that came up was, it's actually very linked to the developmental origins of fetal programming. As you know, Carmen, the discussions when we are looking at low and middle income countries is around undernutrition. Many LMICs are facing the double burden where you have increasing rates of overweight and obesity, but you still have undernourished women who are getting pregnant and who are likely to then have infants who are at increased risk of epigenetic effects. So the question I think that is coming from a colleague, Kuber Adhikari, is, and I think I'm going to kind of rephrase it. His question is which has a higher impact on neurodevelopment of offspring, maternal obesity or maternal undernutrition? My question is, has anybody actually looked at undernutrition and neurodevelopment?
So there have been studies, really the whole developmental programming theories from Baker really started with the famine sort of in the last century. And so that's really where the original data stemmed from when it came to the impact of famine and undernutrition, and also exposure to adverse life events like, seismic activity like earthquake, and obviously how that impacts sort of availability of nutritious food and during pregnancy. And they did see obviously increased risk for the same adverse neurodevelopmental outcomes in the children, as well as adverse cardiovascular, metabolic effect. But I don't know that in terms of comparing the estimates that they've been, because it's really hard, because then you have to take two different populations, right? You're going to have to take a population that has a higher prevalence of obesity and compare the estimates for that particular exposure, and another one that has a higher prevalence of undernutrition. And so I think that it's really hard to find, because there's the issue with numbers, right? And so finding a cohort study, or maybe it then sort of begs the question for like joining multiple cohorts and really do a comparison when it comes to the differential impact of obesity versus undernutrition. But I'm not aware of any studies comparing using the same methodology with the same population, comparing effect estimates of undernutrition versus overweight. Obviously, my brain has been focusing on overweight and obesity, been studying in the US, but obviously, when you look at your low birth weight population and your SGA population, there's also significant association with neurodevelopment and higher risk for obesity long term.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, because what we have noticed in Jordan is, for instance, that the low birth weight prevalence is actually high. So you have maternal overweight obesity, but you also have low birth weight. It's an interesting public health scenario when it comes to Jordan.
And low birth weight really do also translate into higher catch-up weight gain
Yeah.
And these children
That
then
can
as
be.
adolescent and as adult also have increased risk for obesity.
Correct, and insulin resistance. And I think that that's the part that seems to be emerging with the developmental origins, is it began with this idea of undernutrition and how it affects, the epigenetic effects of undernutrition. But in fact, it has expanded to the fact that it's not just undernutrition, it is a poor fetal environment.
Exactly.
It's overnutrition as well. And that's the part that's very critical for countries which have very high rates of overweight and obesity, but also for countries which have the sort of both overweight and underweight scenario occurring.
Exactly. And overnutrition doesn't necessarily imply better nutrition, right? You can have overnutrition in terms of excessive calories, but as I was mentioning, it's more so the quality of the diet, right? So you might be eating a diet that is really high in processed foods and lack the proper macronutrients that are similar to a diet of a mom who's undernourished. So, so that's really where the similarities, I believe, really lie in terms of the actual macronutrient content of the diet.
Yeah. So the next question that we have is basically 2 or 3 parts. And before I go to that, because I think I need to unpackage it myself, but there is a question that is a very sort of a question with people who are in practice, who have to counsel patients, who have to counsel obese pregnant women. So what would be practical diet counseling in this scenario with the data that you have? What would you recommend to dietitians?
Yeah. Very good question. That's what once when I have discussions with my OB colleagues, it usually comes up in that discussion. So the dietary guideline for Americans, so it is a really good resource. And I'm assuming it's in terms of sort of good dietary quality will apply to every other population. Has really specific guidelines in terms of dietary intake, not necessarily in pregnancy, but just overall, because when I did the analysis looking at the role of diet among mothers with obesity, it was actually data that extrapolated recommendations from the dietary guidelines for Americans. So how does that diet look like? It's really essentially a Mediterranean diet. So high in veggies, low in processed foods, low in saturated fats. So a plate that is half vegetables and legumes and rich in fish. We talk about 2 servings of fish a week, and nuts, grains. So really typically the typical Mediterranean diet is when you look at the literature, has been found to be associated consistently with improved both maternal outcomes in terms of pregnancy outcomes and perinatal outcomes, and even in terms of long-term growth outcomes, as I showed in my data. There's also the issue of weight gain. So I usually get asked the question whether what matters more, is it obesity entering pregnancy or the excessive amount of weight that is gained during pregnancy. And so obviously one relates to the other. Mothers that have obesity are also more likely to gain excessive weight in pregnancy. And some of them actually in extreme obesity are less likely to gain appropriate amount of weight. So, but there's definitely an interaction effect, additive effect when you add excessive weight gain in pregnancy on top of starting pregnancy already obese. But if you have to choose between pre-pregnancy obesity and gestational weight gain, obesity alone is really the strongest risk factor for these adverse outcomes. Obviously, when most practitioners meet moms, they meet moms when she's already pregnant, right? Typically, the first OB visits are around 12 weeks of pregnancy or so. So, I spoke about sort of the critical window for intervention, which we think is probably early in pregnancy. And so it really begs us to really sort of change our framework around perinatal counseling, and it should really start before pregnancy in terms of just advocating for changes in any one woman of childbearing age to really strive for improved dietary quality and weight loss prior to conception. Because we do believe that a lot of this developmental programming is happening in the first trimester. Obviously, all is not lost. If you're meeting your mom who has a BMI of 35 or 40 and she's at 12 weeks of pregnancy. I think that counseling on proper dietary changes, activity level, we're also finding that physical activity also helps. And really sort of maintaining the weight gain within sort of the Institute of Medicine recommendation for mothers with obesity will be particularly helpful. But there's really, we yet don't have really strong data to inform us on exactly what kinds of recommendation we should share with this mother. So hence the reason we're actually conducting a pre-conception lifestyle intervention for mothers with obesity currently at Tufts under the Pat Catalano's directorship. And so mothers with obesity are randomized to a lifestyle intervention with nutrition intervention and exercise after their first delivery, but before their second baby. And we're finding some cool findings in that study. So more to come.
Yeah, we have to bring you back for that, for those analyses. So yeah, I think this sort of what you've just highlighted also answers a comment that was made by a colleague from Jordan about the fact that in Jordan, it's an issue of knowledge, and that often when women appear with at pregnancy with a gynecologist or an obstetrician, a lot of the focus is on supporting them in sort of treatment options, are assessing gestational diabetes, their risk for hypertension and preeclampsia, but not really very much around lifestyle. And I think what you've just outlined is here's what you can do, but that in fact the lifestyle interventions or approaches need to begin pre-conception.
Exactly.
And then I think the question that we had, one question from a colleague in Jordan, which I feel you might be able to answer very quickly, keeping in track that we are a little running late, but I think there is an important discussion here. There were two parts to the question. One was her question on when we were looking at the sort of relationship of fatty acids and the inflammatory index. What did you control for? Because one of the comments was total antioxidant levels and maybe 25 hydroxy D3. These are known to mitigate inflammation in obese mothers. So were these factors controlled for in any of your analyses?
Yes, so the dietary inflammatory index is really an assessment that is based on the macronutrient intakes of one diet. So it really looks at all of the major macronutrients that are so vitamin D, like your antioxidants, your CE folate, your omega-3s, your omega-6, your saturated fatty acids, and it essentially ascribe a score when it comes to general correlations between these macronutrients and nutrient values with inflammation. And so using already published data showing sort of effect size between each of these nutrients and how they relate to inflammation, and then ascribing a total overall score of an inflammatory potential of one's diet. And so it takes all of these nutrients in consideration when assessing one's DII, and that's what we use as an aggregate measure of one's dietary quality. And similarly, other dietary indices like the HEI, and the HEI really looks at major food groups, doesn't really break down in terms of micronutrients intake. So looks at saturated foods like red meats and unsaturated fats and legumes and fish. And so this is already, these food groups already encapsulate the extent to which one's diet is rich or poor in micronutrients. And we feel that assessing dietary quality with indices that aggregate all of these nutrients are important, because when you consume a diet, each micronutrients do not have like individual effects. They all are in consortium, right? So it's a combination of your Ds and your 3s and your omega-3s and your E's and your folate that sort of gives you sort of this general impact on your metabolic health, right? I think that we're so used to like trying to find what is the magic bullet. Is it omega-3? Is it vitamin D? Is it folate? But I think that's why a lot of the studies that have done sort of individual macronutrient supplementation have not been successful, because we really have to change our overall diet, because these macronutrients don't act in isolation. They're all parts of metabolic pathways that act sort of together, right? I don't know if that makes sense.
No, that's totally, yeah. That's perfect. So then the other question that came from that the colleague in Jordan was around the EPA DHA supplements. And if there are any updated recommendations regarding omega-3 fatty acids for women who are obese in pregnancy. I know you mentioned that there's likely to be differential doses required. But
yes, unfortunately not yet. So there's still sort of blanket recommendations, from ACOG when it comes to, servings of fish per week. And typically they're really focusing on like food intake and less so on the fish oil intake. Again, just, because of what I just said earlier in terms of the whole food being more important than sort of the individual macronutrients. But there's really no specific recommendations for mothers with obesity, which is interesting because mothers with obesity have lower concentrations in general of omega-3s and particularly DHA and EPAs. Their children have higher risk for adverse outcome, increased risk for ADHD, autism, learning difficulties, and increased risk for obesity long-term. So I think we really need a study that finds a proper dose that looked at outcome evaluation, both short-term and long-term, to be able to inform these guidelines. And hopefully in my lifetime, we're going to get there.
Yeah. And then one last question, and then we will wrap up, because I think there's a question that has just come in about, is maternal obesity a contraindication or an enabler for using multiple micronutrient supplements? Now, if Carmen, in a lot of low and middle income countries, and actually it's a WHO recommendation that pregnancy supplementation should shift from iron folate to multiple micronutrient supplements because of its effects on birth outcomes. And I don't know if you have any insights on how does maternal obesity affect the use of multiple micronutrient supplements?
Very good question. So I'm going to say this. So there are studies by Sabatama Sen or Rimi Sen, my mentor, that have shown that mothers with obesity, both systemically and in their breast milk, there's association with lower level of micronutrients. And that's the reason why I had briefly mentioned the randomized control study of prenatal vitamins among mothers with obesity, supplementing them with extra, CE folate vitamins, and the outcome was to look at inflammation and inflammation attenuation, but also a secondary outcome looking at growth outcomes. So we did not. We think the study was not powered adequately because we did not see any differences in inflammation, which was the primary goal in inflammation or oxidative stress. We did see a slight bump in our antioxidant micronutrient level, the CE folate levels, particularly the B6 levels. But when it comes to evaluating the impact on the offspring, I'm actually in the middle of looking at that data as a secondary analysis. And hopefully, I think that, best case scenario, we don't see any worse outcomes, right? And then even more wanted, we see an improvement in our neurodevelopmental outcomes. So hopefully in the next year or so, that paper is going to come out, and that will be able to answer whether we're seeing any adverse effect of supplementing mothers with obesity with macronutrients. So more to come.
More to come. So on that note, I have to say this has been so fabulous. It's been a fabulous presentation, and the conversation following that with, all the fantastic Q&A that came in, and I got to be the one asking you the questions rather than the people asking you directly. But there's been a fabulous conversation. I'm really looking forward to hearing more about the work that's coming. I know the folks online are probably I'm not just saying probably, I'm sure they would love to hear more from you. But on that note, thank you so much, Carmen. It's been an absolute pleasure listening to you, and good luck with all the new research and analyses, and we will have you back on again. Thank you so much. And thanks everybody for staying on late. It's really appreciated.
Thank you so much, Shibani, and thank you for all the wonderful questions, and looking forward to coming back and presenting the follow-up to all the studies.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a good rest of your day, wherever you are.